And I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. He's a member of the group, and I haven't heard him share his story in a long time, so I'm very excited to introduce to you Peter in San Francisco.
Well, good morning to everyone here. It's good to see a lot of old friends and some new faces that have shown up in the last few months. My name is Peter. I'm a sober alcoholic in San Francisco. And it's nice to see all of you here. It's a little cloudy morning. We've had a lot of rain and more is due in, and that's just great. What I'm going to do in my share today is, first of all, I'm going to give you just the facts, essentially a brief history of my life, okay, without really commentary on its meaning, so that you get the background of the history, the context. Then I'll talk a little bit about, well, what did all of this mean? What did I learn? How did I react to life? What were the good points, the bad points, the good and the ugly? All right. And, where I essentially ended up today and what my life is about. And then briefly, I'll do what is generally referred to as the drunkalogue. I'll talk about the drinking days. Okay. 33 years, mostly of gentlemanly drinking, but the last couple of years really got bad. And then I'll talk about the last 34 years of sobriety and some of the things I've learned and how I deal with the issues and the joys and the sorrows of today. So let me begin at the beginning. I was born in San Francisco in 1938. I grew up in Berkeley. My mother was born in San Francisco, and her grandfather was an English sea captain who arrived in San Francisco in August of 1849, bringing a whole load, 150 potential 49ers and prospectors heading for the gold fields. And my family on my mother's side has then lived around the Bay Area since the 1840s and 50s. My mother grew up here. She went to schools. I actually went to the same junior high in Berkeley that she went to in 1917. She went to Cal, graduated Cal in 26, and became a professional photographer. And she also joined the Sierra Club, went on Sierra Club trips. And in the 1920s and 30s, she became one of the foremost skiers and mountaineers and climbers in the Sierra, actually in the world. She was a dynamo, a red-headed dynamo. And boy, she did not have any religious orientation. When I asked her later on what she believed in, she just said, well, I guess I'm just an old heathen. And I've taken up that term and use it myself. To her, nature was the higher power, the wonderful thing. Okay, so then my father was from Boston, a gentleman from Boston. And after college in 1909, he came to San Francisco and eventually became an accountant, a CPA, had his own office. But also he was a conservationist, a leader in the Sierra Club, a mountaineer in his own right, and a historian of the exploration of the Western United States, particularly the mountain areas and climbing in the Sierra and Rocky Mountains. So, did I mention he was a Christian Scientist, quite different from my mother? Okay, I had a younger sister and two younger brothers. And in the 1940s and 50s, we took lots of trips around the Western United States in our red Woody Pontiac station wagon, camping out all over the place in national parks, in the deserts, in the mountains, on the seashore, and just exploring all over the West when we were kids. At 6, I began to ski. I was taught climbing by my parents in the Sierra Club, trips in the Sierra, and backpacking. And in high school, I became quite expert. I had an opportunity to do a lot of work with horses and became a horseman a gymkhana, and also learned how to pack a mule and go on pack trips in the mountains. In 1956, I went east, get away from home as far as I could, went to east to Dartmouth College. And at Dartmouth, I was on the ski patrol, very much involved in the mountaineering club, and majored in geology and geography. During the summers, I worked as a whitewater guide for Hatch River expeditions on the Western rivers, and also in Alaska and on Mount Rainier for the Foundation for Glacial Research as a field, this is when I was in college, as a field assistant in glaciology, and that was my specialty, particularly climatology and glaciology in my undergraduate years. I graduated from Dartmouth in 1960 and went to the University of Colorado, where I shifted over under the influence of a wonderful Filipino professor into historical geography. And that was extremely important in my education. I got my master's there in 62, joined the Peace Corps, and was in the first Peace Corps group that went to Nepal from 1962 to 64. That was quite an experience. I'll talk about that later. Okay. Since then, let's see. After Nepal, where do we want to pick that up? I over the years participated in a variety of scientific expeditions, primarily as a photographer and as a glaciologist and geologist there. When I got out of the Peace Corps, I got married, continued graduate work at the University of California, Berkeley, and then was offered a position to start the geography department at Cabrillo College in Santa Cruz, where I taught for 20 years. We had 3 children, no, excuse me, 2 children, a daughter and a son. And I traveled with my wife and with my students literally all over the world. I took field trips with my students, college students, all over the Southwest and throughout Asia, India, and even took the first student tour through China in 1981. Okay. In Santa Cruz, let's see, what do we want to do? I got an old Victorian farmhouse down there and spent years restoring it into a top-notch, really a beautiful place on several acres of land where I planted a vineyard. And eventually, once the kids grew up and had left the nest, turned that into a bed and breakfast inn. I was involved in a lot of local political issues, primarily environmental issues, conservation, and eventually in 1985, the kids were out, the inn was going, I was getting rather frazzled. I'll talk about that later on. My drinking was beginning to get to me, and I was offered a deal on the bed and breakfast inn, which allowed me to essentially retire from college. My wife at that time was an old friend. I'll talk about that later, maybe. We split up amicably, and I left Santa Cruz, came up to the Bay Area to join the digital revolution. In 1992, I became involved in the digital archiving of historical materials at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, and eventually in 93 started my own business of essentially lecturing, giving workshops, and helping people record digitally their family histories, their life stories, and became an oral historian. And I did a lot of, produced a number of books on life stories and biographies. Particularly notable was the biography I did of Edward Eyre, the California pioneer, who became a prominent San Francisco businessman, but had served as the lieutenant colonel of the California Cavalry in the Civil War. Since 1988, I've lived here in San Francisco with my current wife, Mary, a teacher for 33 years in the San Francisco high schools. She taught Spanish and German, and she ended up in the Philippines. Well, she was born in the Philippines. Her parents were from Vienna and had to get out in 1939 when Hitler came in. They were secular Jewish, and they got to the Philippines, where her father was a professor at the University of the Philippines. And of course, then Japan came in 1941, same as at Pearl Harbor, and it was difficult times. But she grew up in the Philippines, went to the American school, came over to the US for her college, and became a high school teacher in San Francisco with lots of very interesting multicultural friends. Okay, so now my son is still lives in Santa Cruz, where he grew up, and is a master cabinet maker. He has his own shop. My daughter learned Spanish. Both kids went to a Spanish school when I had a sabbatical in 1972, 73 in Spain, and they learned Spanish. So my daughter actually ended up being a Spanish high school teacher in Jackson, Wyoming, and is currently retired. And I've got a wonderful granddaughter from my son and his wife, and she's over in England right now studying under the director of the London Symphony Orchestra, and she's a choral director, and a lot of fun there. My two grandsons are now in college. The oldest is a pre-med at University of Vermont, and the younger one just started Michigan State. I've served on a number of boards here in San Francisco. Before that, in Santa Cruz, I was very active in a number of environmental issues. And I've served here in the city in the last 33 years with the Association of Personal Historians on their board for many years, and then on the Save the Redwood League on their council, and also more recently on the board of the Book Club of California. And my wife and I then enjoy our multicultural life in the city, and our family here and friends abroad. And we travel all over the world, and particularly to Mexico over the last 35 years. And we have several places in Mexico, particularly in Mazatlan. So that's the chronology. But what does it all mean? Those are the facts, the background. Oh, what were the joys and the sorrows? What did I learn about the world and myself? How did I feel? What were my successes and failures? And how did 33 years drinking alcohol and then 34 years of sobriety affect my life? Okay. First, by and large, I had a wonderful childhood. Okay. There was lots of love in the family. It was, and I also had the experience of several older sisters of different cultures. When I was a little kid, we had a Chinese girl studying at Cal, and she became an older sister and taught me a lot about Chinese culture. Later on, I had a young orphaned teenager from Mexico who became an older sister, and she taught me my first Spanish. And then later on, my parents took in a mother and daughter that had just been released from the Japanese internment camp, Mary and Isako Sawai, and they lived with us for several years, coming out of the internment camp in 1945. And so I had an older sister who was of Japanese culture. In high school, I had many kids in Berkeley, both Latino, Black, all sorts of class in my junior high, and was exposed to a lot of different cultures in the Bay Area. And my parents had a whole variety of different friends, climbers from all over the world. And essentially, I grew up in a multicultural environment, so that when I eventually got out into the world, and with some guidance from a wonderful professor at Colorado, Guzman Rivas from the Philippines, and went into the Peace Corps and lived in Nepal for 2 years, in a non-Western culture. This expanded my horizons tremendously. Finally, when I got into the teaching, my relationship with my students and taking them on field trips, learning a lot myself, and then transferring my knowledge and understanding of different cultures to my students. It was a community college, so my students went from teenagers all the way up to retired teachers and military people and housewives coming back into school. So it was a rich, rewarding experience. Okay. I've also, of course, my whole life has been in looking at science, the natural world, as a physical geographer, as a glaciologist, climatologist, and I know in other words, science. I was trained in science as an undergraduate, and then with Guzman's orientation in graduate school, turned to historical geography and put in the human element of the great civilizations and their cultures. So yes, a wonderful life, but there have been the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that have left their mark, okay? Particularly several here. I was shamed for my dyslexia throughout my educational career, particularly the first grade, when I mispronounced or couldn't read a word on the blackboard. All the other kids could do it, and I made a mess of it, and the teacher called me out. And I was accused, and Louise knows all about this. When you're a dyslexic, you are thought to be considerably different and not trying hard enough, and just, well, it's not a comfortable thing to grow up being accused of being lazy and avoiding the, memorizing the proper way to spell words. Then also another thing, that when I was 11, my 9-year-old younger brother died of meningitis. And that, of course, upset the entire family. And it was a thing that my mother was affected tremendously by that. But all my brother, other brother, and my sister, of course, have lived with that. We occasionally talk about our younger brother who died. And that was a tragic thing. But by and large, I had a wonderful life and still do today. But I began drinking with my first drink. Well, let's see, why not? My first drink in 1955, I was 17 years old. The family went to Europe. And I had a chance to do some climbing, first in Wales, with some of the leaders of the Mount Everest and Mount Kanchenjunga expeditions. Sir John Hunt and Charles Evans went climbing with them on some beautiful rocks up in Wales near Penigurid. And then we went over to the continent, and I did a little climbing with a guide in the Dolomites. And then the grand finale, before I came back home in August of 55, we went to Zermatt. I got a guide and went up to climb the Matterhorn. And stayed at the hut overnight, got up early in the morning, and to a blizzard and storm coming around the mountain. There were 12 or 13 parties headed up the mountain. All of them turned back except me and my guide and a Swiss girl and her guide, who proceeded up in the sleet, the storm, the thunders, the thunderbolts, the winds, hail, sleet, the snow coming down on us. And after a good, really tough experience, although I was a good enough climber to do it, and I had a great guide, a guy, his father had actually been a guide way back before him. He was about 26, 27 years old. I was 17, and we made it to the top between claps of thunder and lightning. And so we descended. The Swiss girl and her guide were right behind us. And we stopped once we got off the difficult part of the mountain and took shelter underneath a little overhang and cave. The other guide reached into his knapsack and pulled out a bottle filled with some green liquid. And he started to pass that around. And of course they took it, and I took a good swig or two of it. Licorice taste, and wow, absinthe. And that was my first drink, and on the side of the Matterhorn. Later, 6 months later, in my senior year in high school, I'll tell that story later on about my second drink, which was quite an adventure in and of itself. But anyway, that began a long history of drinking like a gentleman. Eventually, I had really a fine wine center. I made wine and beer myself in my Victorian house and my property there in Santa Cruz. And I drank in the afternoon. Never drank really before 4 o'clock. And eventually, well, I started out with just, say a scotch or something like that, and then wine with dinner. But over the years, it progressed more and more. But still, by the time we get into the 80s, people did in the family say, Peter, don't you think you're drinking a little bit much or something like that? And of course, I was in complete denial about the whole thing. Someday I'll tell you about the story in 1983, when I was on the American East Face of Everest expedition, not on the climbing team, but on the photography team and science team. We trekked into the base camp. This was in through Tibet. And for 3 weeks, we were sort of in China. Going in through China, you could get plenty of booze if you wanted to. But I got one bottle of scotch I took with me, and I managed to save that scotch, just a little bit of cocktail every evening when we got into camp. And I managed to take that one bottle of scotch and have it last for 3 weeks. So here again, and I stopped drinking for several times, but for several months, I didn't have any problem. But eventually it was building up. And in the early 80s, and I'm talking about when I was 45 years old, I still could control how much I drank. But during the next 5 years, by the time I left the bed and breakfast and went up into the Bay Area here to get into a whole new environment, I was drinking more and more. I met a wonderful gal named Mary, and she's the one from the Philippines. I'd been in the Philippines earlier doing some studies at the Rice Institute there, and we really hit it off. And we started traveling together. And after a year, though, I had stopped drinking really when I left Santa Cruz. I said, okay, I can get it. I don't have to drink anymore to take the edge off of all the pressure I was under there. And so I said, okay, when I'm having a new life here in the city and doing new things, and I could stop. And all the pressure was off of the classes and all the stuff of the running a bed and breakfast in. So I took a vacation from drinking. But then once I really felt good and had a good relationship, we're traveling around into Europe and so forth. I said, I can drink again. Why not? I can drink now, no longer any pressure. And I had gone, my second wife, before I left Santa Cruz, had suggested that I go to an AA meeting. Okay, because this was about 80, after the Everest expedition in 83, 84. And so I went to a men's AA meeting, and they were all talking about God and crashing their cars, beating their wives. And I said, my gosh, I'm not one of them. I'm not an alcoholic there. I can control my drinking. Well, ha. So I left that. But eventually, once I started drinking again back up here in the city, I couldn't control it. I mean, I didn't drink before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but boy, once I started drinking, I couldn't stop for the evening. And I knew that. And it began very difficult. And my girlfriend, who now my wife, Mary, called my sister and said, what's the matter with Peter? He's totally changed. Because when I met her, I wasn't drinking. And then over the following year, I drank more and more and more. And she asked my sister, what's going on with Peter? And my sister said, get rid of him. He's an alcoholic. Well, the two gals got together. They rounded up the family and they got a consultant, and they had a little family intervention. September 25th, 1988. I was 50 years old just a couple of months earlier. When I walked into my brother's house, I saw the family there. I knew what it was. The previous months I knew something was horribly wrong. I could drink, and control it. No, I couldn't. And I didn't know what to do. I was even thinking of going off the bridge, going back to Nepal, where I could drink without any interference. But when I went into my brother's house, I knew it was an intervention. And in that one moment, it was over. I was free. I knew I could stop drinking, and that whole thing was over. And they'd lined up a wonderful little rehab over in Marin for me, my sister and my now wife, Mary, a Teamsters, small little Teamsters rehab. And they said, would you want to go over there and take a 28-day rehab program? And I said, yes. And I went over there, spent essentially 4 weeks learning about alcoholism. They had people coming in, and I said, aha, I'm an alcoholic. And that began my sobriety 34 years ago, this last September. And all the God stuff of traditional AA, of course, at San Francisco, there were a lot of free thinkers, atheist agnostics, Buddhists and whatnot. So the whole religious aspect was not really emphasized. And there were other people who were more free thinkers that I could, pal around with, which I did. And again, I had seen enough cultures around the world and how people lived totally different ways than we did here. Non-Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Shinto, Sikh, Zoroastrian, all of these other and tribal religions too, I'd seen. And they all had gods and higher powers of one sort or another. And so the particular Christian ones didn't bother me a bit. And I had some good friends said, look take what you can, leave the rest. And so for the last 34 years, AA has been a very important part of my life. Where am I on time here? Bridget?
You have plenty of time.
Okay. Well, let me wrap up with this then. I got a whole new career once I got sober. It took a couple of years to do it, but then I got into oral history and biography, and that has been tremendously rewarding for me. For many years, over 20 years, well, if you count my graduate work and teaching and all that stuff in Nepal and earlier, I had been the teacher for 25 years. And I was telling the students all about the world. And that was good. I was pretty well familiar with it. We traveled all over and so forth. And it was nice telling and showing people how the world operated, different cultures and different civilizations, how they developed and what they thought and experienced. And the physical part of it too, physical geography, weather, climate, geology, all those things I taught. But once I got into the oral history, I spent essentially almost 25 years again listening to people, listening what they had to say about their lives and recording that, and then putting that into an edited format, and then designing and producing the books for them and their families, and sometimes for public publication as well. So that has been extremely rich and experience learning about all sorts of people's lives. Unfortunately, COVID came in and that put a stop to that activity. And it also, I was going to maybe generally two meetings, AA meetings a week here, but discovered secular AA right here, this Zoom, with all of you. And whereas I had a good number of friends, and I still do keep them, but there are only a dozen or so from traditional AA here in the city. But now, after coming on over 3 years in SRG, I feel like I've got dozens of friends all over the world. And it is so much, worthwhile and joyous, if you will, to see all of you just about every day who've gone through the same thing, that horrible thing of being trapped by alcohol and then getting free and leaving, interesting, fascinating, creative, wonderful lives today. Still troubled by many of the things that drove many, many people to drink. Fortunately, I didn't have to go that way. My drinking just captured me, and addicted me over a period of time. But many people, of course, drink for self-medication, and my heart goes out to them. But here again, the wonderful thing of secular AA is that no matter what your beliefs are, in higher powers or not, and all sorts of something in between, here you can talk with and communicate with and listen to and tell your stories about your experiences among people who understand. You all understand what we've been through. And that is the community of secular AA, which I think is one of the greatest things that's ever happened to those of us who got trapped by alcohol. So I wish you all well. And it's been a pleasure to get to know you over the last several years. And the years to come, I'm looking forward to it. Oh, one more thing before we're going to get into the open part of the meeting. This is the Q&A part. Any questions you got, feel free to ask. Okay, so let's Bridget, spend 5 minutes. If anyone has any questions they might want to ask about what I've been talking about this morning. And then we can get into just a general share. So what are your questions?